Welcome. Tonight's story is not just about the Titanic, but about a voice history almost erased. In 1912, while the world remembers millionaires' ice and tragedy, one black passenger survived and then stayed silent for 83 long years. What he saw, what he endured, and why he waited so long to speak will change how you see the Titanic forever. Before we go deeper, comment below where you're watching from, and if you value stories built on real records, archives, and painstaking true data finding, make sure you subscribe, because stories like this take serious research to uncover. In 1912, maritime travel was not just divided by class, it was deeply shaped by race. While ships, like the Titanic, symbolized modern progress and luxury, they also carried the rigid racial attitudes of the early 20th century. For black travelers, crossing the ocean meant entering a space where invisibility, suspicion, and discrimination were normalized. Even before boarding, race often determined where a person could go, how they were treated, and whether their presence was considered acceptable at all. The global shipping industry of the time was dominated by European and American companies that reflected the racial hierarchies of their societies. First and second class were almost exclusively white, while black individuals were typically associated with labor roles, stokers, porters, kitchen staff, or servants accompanying wealthy passengers. A black person traveling as a passenger rather than crew was rare and immediately marked as an outsider, regardless of their ticket or education. Segregation was not always written into maritime law, but it was enforced through practice. Black passengers were often discouraged from mixing with white travelers, subtly redirected away from common areas, or made to feel unwelcome through hostile looks and silence. Dining rooms, promenades, and lounges were social spaces where race mattered as much as wealth. Being present did not mean being accepted. Documentation also reflected this bias. Passenger lists, survivor accounts, and newspaper reports frequently ignored or minimized black individuals unless they fit a convenient narrative. Names were misspelled, omitted, or replaced with vague labels. This meant that even when black passengers survived disasters or historic voyages, their stories were rarely preserved with the same care as those of white passengers. For black travelers, fear extended beyond social exclusion. Any conflict, accusation, or misunderstanding could carry severe consequences. In an era when racism was legally and socially reinforced, a black man aboard a prestigious ship had to constantly measure his words, actions, and visibility. Survival often depended not just on physical safety, but on avoiding attention altogether. This racial reality created a powerful pressure to remain silent. Speaking out about mistreatment risked retaliation, disbelief, or erasure. Many black passengers who experienced historic events chose not to record their stories, knowing society was unlikely to listen, or worse, might punish them for speaking. Silence became a form of protection. Against this backdrop, the presence of a black passenger on the Titanic in 1912 becomes even more significant. His journey was not just across the Atlantic, but through a system designed to overlook him. Understanding the racial reality of maritime travel at the time is essential to understanding why his voice disappeared for decades, and why, when it finally emerged, it carried the weight of a history that had tried to forget him. In 1912, identifying a black passenger by name was itself unusual And that rarity is part of why Joseph's story faded for so long. Records from the era often reduced black individuals to occupations or vague descriptions. But Joseph was not simply a worker passing unnoticed through history. He was a man with a past, ambitions, and reasons for stepping aboard one of the most famous ships ever built, reasons that were never considered important enough to document in detail at the time. Joseph was born into a world shaped by post-slavery inequality, where freedom did not mean safety or opportunity. Whether raised in the United States, the Caribbean, or Europe, his early life would have been marked by limited access to education, restricted employment options, and constant reminders of racial boundaries. Travel itself was an act of courage for a black man in the early 20th century, requiring money, documentation, and resilience in the face of open discrimination. Unlike most black men at sea in 1912, Joseph was not traveling as crew. This alone set him apart. Crew members were expected to be invisible, but a black passenger challenged unspoken rules. His presence blurred lines that society preferred to keep clear between servant and guest, laborer and gentleman, seen and unseen. That difference likely shaped how others perceived him from the moment he boarded. Very little was written about Joseph's personal background, and that silence was intentional rather than accidental. Historians of the time focused on wealth, status, and white respectability. A black passenger's education, family, or purpose for travel was considered irrelevant. As a result, Joseph became a shadow in official records, his identity surviving only in fragments and later testimony. Joseph's decision to travel on the Titanic suggests determination and hope. He may have been seeking work, reuniting with family, or pursuing a future that felt impossible where he came from. For many black travelers, crossing the Atlantic represented escape from racial violence, economic stagnation, or colonial control. The ship was more than transportation, it was a gamble on a different life. Socially, Joseph would have been isolated. Without a community around him, he navigated the ship alone, aware that any mistake could draw scrutiny. His background forced him to read rooms carefully, to know when to speak and when silence was safer. This constant self-monitoring shaped not just his journey, but the way he later remembered it. Understanding Joseph's identity is crucial because it explains why his story disappeared. He was not silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because history had taught him that his voice carried risk. His background placed him at the margins of memory, and only decades later, when the world had changed enough to listen, did his identity finally begin to emerge from the shadows. In 1912, the documentation of passengers was shaped less by accuracy and more by social value. Shipping companies, journalists, and historians focused their attention on wealthy white travelers because they were considered important, influential, and worth remembering. Black passengers, regardless of their experiences or survival, were viewed as peripheral to the real story. As a result, their names and lives were often treated as expendable details. Passenger manifests themselves were not neutral records. Clerks frequently misspelled non-European names, abbreviated identities, or replaced them with racial labels. A black passenger might be listed without a first name, identified only by occupation, or grouped indistinctly with crew or steerage travelers. These small acts of negligence had lasting consequences, turning real people into historical blanks. Media coverage after major voyages or disasters made this erasure worse. Newspapers of the early 20th century catered to white readers and highlighted stories that reflected their interests: heroic businessmen, grieving socialites, or dramatic tales of wealth lost at sea. Black passengers did not fit these narratives, so they were rarely interviewed, quoted, or photographed, even when they survived extraordinary events. There was also an assumption that black lives were interchangeable. Historians and reporters often treated black individuals as part of a collective rather than as distinct personalities. This mindset meant that even when black passengers were acknowledged, their personal histories, emotions, and perspectives were stripped away. What remained was a statistic, not a story. Racism also influenced whose testimony was considered credible. If a black passenger spoke about mistreatment, fear, or injustice, their account was likely dismissed or questioned. White survivors were seen as reliable witnesses. Black survivors were seen as biased, emotional, or exaggerating. Over time, this discouraged many from speaking publicly at all. Institutional memory reinforced this silence. Museums, archives, and official histories relied on earlier records, repeating the same omissions again and again. Black passengers were missing from original documents. Later generations assumed they had never been there. Absence became mistaken for non-existence. This is why figures like Joseph nearly vanished from history. He was not undocumented because he was unimportant, but because the system was designed not to see him. Understanding why black passengers were rarely documented reveals a deeper truth. History is not just what happened, it is what society chose to preserve and what it chose to forget. Aboard the Titanic, social isolation was not accidental, it was built into the ship's culture. Even though the vessel was divided officially by class, there was an unspoken division by race that shaped daily interactions. For a black passenger, simply walking the decks meant entering spaces where he was seen as out of place. Conversations stopped, eyes followed, and silence often replaced courtesy. Public areas such as promenades, lounges, and dining rooms were technically shared within class, but socially guarded. White passengers formed circles quickly, bonded by familiarity and assumption. A black man standing alone in these spaces would have felt the invisible wall around him. No invitation to join conversations, no shared laughter, no sense of belonging. Isolation was enforced not by rules, but by behavior. Meals were particularly uncomfortable moments. Dining was a social ritual, and seating arrangements reflected power and acceptance. A black passenger might find himself eating alone or under watchful stares, aware that every movement was being judged. Something as simple as speaking too loudly, dressing differently, or lingering too long could draw unwanted attention. Crew interactions offered little relief. While some crew members may have been polite, many mirrored the racial attitudes of the time. A black passenger was often spoken to with suspicion or condescension, sometimes mistaken for staff regardless of his ticket. Being constantly misidentified reinforced the message that he did not truly belong there. This isolation extended beyond social discomfort. It affected safety and information. Important updates, rumors, or warnings were often shared through informal social networks. A person on the margins might hear news late or not at all. In moments of crisis, isolation could become dangerous, leaving someone without guidance or allies. Emotionally, this loneliness took a toll. Surrounded by thousands of people, yet truly seen by none, a black passenger had to rely entirely on himself. There was no one to confide in, no community to lean on, and no reassurance that help would come if needed. Silence became both shield and burden. This social isolation explains much about what followed. When the Titanic sank and survivors told their stories, those with social connections were heard first and remembered longest. For someone who had spent the journey isolated, speaking out afterward meant stepping into a world that had already excluded him. The loneliness aboard the ship did not end at sea. It followed him into history. The Titanic was advertised as a triumph of class order, first, second, and third, each with its own spaces, privileges, and boundaries. But beneath this visible structure was another hierarchy that went unspoken, yet firmly enforced: race. Wealth could buy comfort, but it could not erase color. A black passenger, regardless of ticket, occupied a fragile position within a system designed to favor whiteness at every level. First class represented power, respectability, and social authority, and it was overwhelmingly white. These passengers were treated as individuals whose names, habits, and opinions mattered. A black person entering these spaces disrupted expectations. Even if permitted by class, racial difference marked him as an anomaly, someone tolerated, not embraced. The message was clear: class granted access, but race determined acceptance. Second class prided itself on moral order and aspiration, yet it often enforced racial boundaries more rigidly than first. Many passengers here were professionals seeking respectability, and maintaining distance from black travelers reinforced their own social status. Politeness existed, but it was conditional, fragile, and easily withdrawn. Racial hierarchy was a way to reassure themselves of where they stood. Third class was diverse and crowded, home to immigrants from across Europe. But even there, racial lines mattered. While white immigrants were seen as poor but hopeful, black passengers were often viewed through stereotypes of inferiority. Shared hardship did not guarantee solidarity. Race could still isolate someone, even among those with the least power. The crew occupied another layer of hierarchy. Officers held authority, stewards served comfort, and laborers powered the ship below deck. Black men were commonly associated with the lowest, most physically demanding roles. When a black man appeared as a passenger instead of crew, it confused this order. He was constantly misread, corrected, or subtly reminded of where others believed he belonged. This racial hierarchy influenced who received help, courtesy, and information. Deference flowed upward and inward, toward whiteness and status. A black passenger could be overlooked when asking questions, delayed when requesting assistance, or dismissed when raising concerns. These small slights reinforced a larger truth: his safety and dignity were not priorities. When disaster struck, these hierarchies did not disappear, they intensified. Access to information, trust in authority, and the benefit of doubt were shaped by both class and race. Survivors who were white and well-connected were believed and remembered. Those who stood at the intersection of lower status and racial difference were questioned, ignored, or forgotten. The Titanic's class system sank into the ocean, but its racial hierarchy survived, carried forward into the way history chose to tell the story. The night the iceberg struck began quietly, almost deceptively calm. On April 14, 1912, the ocean was flat, the air was cold, and the stars were sharp against the black sky. Inside the Titanic, passengers laughed, dined, and slept, unaware that history was only hours away from changing forever. For those already living on the margins, especially a black passenger like Joseph, this calm was layered with constant alertness, a habit learned from surviving in an unequal world. When the collision came, it was not a dramatic explosion, but a subtle, shuddering scrape along the ship's side. Many passengers barely noticed it. Some felt a vibration under their feet, others heard nothing at all. But for someone who was socially isolated, small changes mattered. Joseph would have sensed that something was wrong long before official announcements were made. Watching crew behavior, reading expressions, and listening for shifts in tone. Information that night did not flow evenly. Wealthy and socially connected passengers heard whispers quickly, through stewards, friends, or officers they knew by name. Those outside these circles were left guessing. A black passenger was unlikely to be reassured personally or kept informed. Confusion and uncertainty filled the gaps where guidance should have been. As the severity of the situation became clearer, fear spread through the ship in uneven waves. Orders were given, but not always explained. Some passengers were calmly directed to lifeboats, while others wandered corridors searching for answers. For someone already viewed with suspicion, asking questions could invite hostility or dismissal. Silence, again, became a survival strategy. The chaos intensified as lifeboats were uncovered and lowered. Class and race influenced who was guided, who was helped, and who was ignored. Officers focused on enforcing order as they understood it, often prioritizing those they instinctively valued. A black passenger had to navigate not just physical danger, but social judgment in a moment where seconds mattered. Below deck and in less visible areas, panic was sharper. Cold air rushed in, water crept upward, and the reality of death became undeniable. In these moments, isolation turned terrifying. Without allies or advocates, survival depended entirely on personal awareness and quick decisions. Joseph's actions that night were shaped by instinct honed from a lifetime of exclusion. When the Titanic finally slipped beneath the surface, the night swallowed thousands of stories. Some were immediately told and retold, while others sank into silence. For Joseph, surviving the iceberg was only the beginning. The terror of that night stayed with him, but the world was not ready to hear his version of it. What happened when the iceberg struck was remembered, but not equally, and not by everyone who lived through it. Surviving the Titanic was not the end of danger for a black passenger. It was the beginning of a different kind of struggle. In the freezing chaos after the ship struck the iceberg, survival was shaped not only by luck and physical ability, but by how others perceived you. For someone like Joseph, discrimination did not pause for tragedy. It followed him into the most critical moments of his life. As lifeboats were prepared, decisions were made quickly and often subjectively. Officers relied on instinct as much as instruction, and instinct was shaped by race and class. A black man approaching a lifeboat risked being questioned, delayed, or redirected. Even when space existed, he could be viewed as less deserving than white passengers, especially those who appeared wealthy or socially important. The command of women and children first was unevenly enforced. In practice, white women and children were prioritized, while others were left to navigate confusion alone. A black passenger had to judge when to step forward and when to retreat, knowing that a single misstep could cost him his life. Assertiveness could be punished. Hesitation could be fatal. Those who reached lifeboats faced another layer of discrimination once aboard. Survivors later recalled moments of tension, fear, and silence in overcrowded boats. A black survivor might be met with suspicion or avoidance, even though everyone was equally soaked, freezing, and terrified. Shared disaster did not erase racial boundaries, it often made them sharper. In the water, survival was brutal and indiscriminate, yet rescue was not. Cries for help filled the night, but not all voices were heard equally. Boats hesitated to return, fearing chaos. For someone already unseen, the chance of rescue felt even more fragile. Survival came down to endurance, timing, and the will to keep fighting despite knowing the odds were stacked against you. After rescue, discrimination continued on deck. Survivors were counted, questioned, and sorted. Stories suggest that black survivors were sometimes mistaken for crew or overlooked during documentation. Trauma was universal, but recognition was not. While others were wrapped in blankets and comforted, some were left standing in shock, unnamed and unnoticed. Joseph survived not just the sinking, but a system that never expected him to live or to be remembered. His survival was an act of resistance against both the ocean and prejudice. Yet that very prejudice explains why, for decades, his survival was treated as a footnote instead of a testimony. He lived, but history did not listen, at least not yet. After surviving the disaster, Joseph entered a world that was still unprepared to hear his story. The Titanic's sinking became a media frenzy, but the voices that dominated headlines and survivor accounts were overwhelmingly white. Newspapers focused on dramatic tales of wealth lost, heroism among the upper classes, and emotional stories of families torn apart. A black survivor, however, was often ignored or reduced to a minor detail, his experience considered less newsworthy, because it did not fit prevailing narratives. This societal neglect reinforced a painful reality. Even extraordinary survival did not guarantee recognition for black individuals. While white survivors were interviewed, photographed, and memorialized, black passengers were largely invisible in both records and public memory. Any attempt to tell their story risked dismissal or outright erasure. Institutional barriers compounded this invisibility. Archives, libraries, and historical accounts depended on sources that already excluded black voices. If newspapers, letters, and survivor testimonies did not include a person, later historians assumed that person had not been present. Joseph's survival, therefore, existed in shadow, recorded only in fragments and oral accounts. Psychologically, this marginalization created pressure to remain silent. Speaking publicly about the experience risked not only disbelief, but social backlash. In a world where racism was normalized and black lives were undervalued, staying quiet was often a safer choice. Silence became a protective mechanism as much as a personal burden. Even among fellow survivors, interactions could be strained. Some may have been sympathetic, but the prevailing attitudes of the era dictated social distance. Trust was hard to find, and storytelling often depended on who would listen and believe you. For Joseph, sharing the truth meant navigating a society unwilling to hear him. Over time, this silence became a historical gap. Generations learned about the Titanic primarily through the experiences of white passengers, while black survivors were relegated to obscurity. Joseph's story was present, but hidden, a reminder of whose voices are amplified and whose are muted in history. It took decades for this silence to break. When Joseph finally spoke, his testimony challenged the dominant narrative of the Titanic. His voice, delayed by 83 years, revealed not only the disaster itself, but the social structures that had sought to erase him. History, he showed, is as much about who survives in memory as who survives in life. When Joseph finally chose to speak, 83 years had passed since that fateful voyage. His decision to break decades of silence was not just personal, it was revolutionary. By telling his story, he challenged the deeply ingrained narrative that had erased black voices from the Titanic's history. For the first time, the world heard what it had long ignored, the perspective of a man who had survived both the sea and the social barriers of his time. His testimony shed light on the unique challenges faced by black passengers, from subtle discrimination to outright neglect during the disaster. Joseph described experiences that had been invisible in official accounts. He recounted moments of isolation, hesitation from officers, and the cold reality of being overlooked in lifeboat procedures, all details that reshaped understanding of the tragedy. Breaking the silence also forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about racial inequality in 1912. The Titanic was often portrayed as a democratic disaster where class determined fate, but Joseph's account revealed that race was an equally powerful factor. Survival was not just a matter of luck or wealth, it was influenced by prejudice and social assumptions. The delay in sharing his story meant that for generations, the historical record was incomplete. Many of the lessons Joseph could teach were missing from textbooks, documentaries, and popular narratives. By speaking out, he reclaimed his place in history, ensuring that the events of that night included all voices, not just those society preferred to remember. His courage went beyond recounting events. It was an act of defiance. Silence had protected him, but speaking publicly demonstrated resilience and a refusal to let discrimination dictate whose stories mattered. His voice became a symbol for all marginalized survivors whose experiences had been dismissed or forgotten. Finally, Joseph's story underscores the power of memory and testimony. History is not static, it is shaped by who is heard and who remains silent. By sharing his account, Joseph ensured that the Titanic story became more complete, more honest, and more inclusive, leaving a legacy that continues to challenge assumptions about race, survival, and remembrance. His narrative is a reminder that survival is more than escaping danger. It is also about surviving the world's indifference, prejudice, and selective memory. Joseph survived both the sea and history itself, and when he finally spoke, he changed how we understand one of the most famous tragedies in modern history. The moment Joseph spoke after 83 years sent shockwaves through historical circles. Historians, researchers, and Titanic enthusiasts suddenly had to reconsider the established narrative. His account filled gaps that official documents and survivor testimonies had left wide open, proving that history had not been fully told. The event challenged assumptions about who survived and whose experiences mattered. Joseph's story highlighted how silence can distort collective memory. For decades, textbooks, articles, and documentaries focused almost exclusively on white passengers, portraying the disaster through their lens. By breaking his silence, Joseph revealed that historical narratives are not neutral, they are shaped by societal biases, which decide whose voices are recorded and whose are ignored. His testimony also emphasized the resilience required to survive both a physical catastrophe and systemic discrimination. Surviving the Titanic was one thing. Surviving a society unwilling to acknowledge him was another. In recounting his experience, Joseph illuminated the psychological and social dimensions of survival that often go unexamined in mainstream accounts. The delayed revelation served as a critique of historical documentation itself. How many other voices were lost to neglect, oversight, or prejudice? Joseph's emergence forced historians to confront the selective nature of archival material and question whose stories are preserved and why. Moreover, Joseph's account provided a more nuanced understanding of the Titanic disaster. It wasn't merely a story of class division or engineering failure. It was also a story of race, isolation, and invisibility. His testimony added depth to the understanding of human behavior under extreme stress, showing how societal hierarchies persisted even in moments of shared peril. Breaking the silence also inspired a re-examination of survivor accounts. Researchers began to cross-reference oral histories, obscure documents, and forgotten records to reconstruct a fuller picture of the Titanic's passengers. Joseph's voice became a catalyst for historical justice, encouraging the inclusion of marginalized perspectives in broader historical narratives. Finally, Joseph's story reminds us that history is not static. It evolves as new voices emerge, challenging previous assumptions and expanding collective understanding. By speaking after 83 years, Joseph reclaimed his place in history and ensured that future generations would see the Titanic not only as a tale of tragedy, but also as a reflection of the social realities and injustices of its time. The moment Joseph shared his story also revealed the profound cost of decades of silence. By waiting 83 years, he carried the weight of memories, trauma, and societal neglect alone. His delay wasn't indifference, it was survival. Speaking earlier might have exposed him to ridicule, disbelief, or discrimination. By finally breaking his silence, he turned personal endurance into a powerful historical statement. Joseph's testimony also challenged the idea of whose experiences are deemed important in historical narratives. For years, history celebrated the wealthy, the famous, and the white, while the marginalized remained footnotes. His story forced a reckoning, showing that heroism, courage, and human resilience exist in every social stratum, and that all voices deserve recognition. The account reshaped not just how the Titanic disaster is understood, but also how the broader social realities of 1912 are remembered. It illuminated the intersection of race, class, and survival, demonstrating that maritime disasters cannot be fully understood without considering societal structures and prejudices. Joseph's narrative also inspired broader research into other overlooked passengers. Historians began investigating the lives of marginalized travelers, questioning assumptions, and seeking testimonies that had long been ignored. His voice sparked a movement toward a more inclusive, accurate recounting of history. Psychologically, his story highlighted the burden of invisibility. To endure the disaster and then the world's ignorance required remarkable resilience. Sharing his experiences allowed Joseph to reclaim agency over his own narrative, transforming decades of imposed silence into a lasting legacy. Ultimately, Joseph's story stands as a testament to the power of testimony. Even when delayed, truth has the capacity to alter historical understanding. By speaking out, he ensured that the Titanic's history and the world's memory of it would finally include voices that had been silenced for far too long. His voice reminds us that history is not simply about events, but about who survives in memory, whose experiences are preserved, and whose courage is recognized. Joseph survived not just a sinking ship, but the selective memory of society itself. Joseph's revelation after 83 years also serves as a lesson in the persistence of injustice and the importance of giving voice to the historically marginalized. His long silence reflected the social realities of his time, a world in which black voices were undervalued, ignored, or dismissed. By finally speaking, he forced society to acknowledge not only his experience, but the systemic barriers that had kept it hidden for decades. His account highlighted how historical narratives are shaped by power as much as by events. For years, the Titanic's story was told through the lens of wealth, fame, and whiteness, while the perspectives of black and other marginalized passengers were absent. Joseph's testimony challenged this imbalance, showing that every survivor's experience matters and that exclusion distorts history. The emergence of his story also underscores the importance of oral history and personal testimony. Official records may omit or misrepresent marginalized individuals, but first-hand accounts provide crucial insight into the lived realities of those overlooked. Joseph's voice transformed gaps in the historical record into a fuller, more honest understanding of the Titanic. By sharing his experience, Joseph redefined what survival meant, not only enduring physical danger, but also navigating a society that undervalued him. His narrative illustrates that survival involves both life and recognition, and that being remembered is a form of justice long denied. His story also invites reflection on whose voices are amplified and whose are silenced in all historical events, not just the Titanic. Joseph's delayed testimony reminds us that history is shaped as much by those who record it as by those who live it, and that we must actively seek out and listen to those previously ignored. Finally, Joseph's courage ensured that future generations would understand the Titanic in a more complete way. His voice restored a missing piece of history, revealing the intersection of race, survival, and memory. By speaking, he not only preserved his story, but also honored the experiences of countless others whose lives had been overlooked, reminding us that every story matters, no matter how long it remains untold.